So Simon, tell me about a favourite punk moment in fashion.
Well, I was sort of toying with two quite extreme different ones. First one was when I remember being quite young, probably about 6, and buying a Toya Wilcox album in Tesco on vinyl, which seemed quite punky. And then the other one was more recently with Donatella, obviously in the Vunk collection, and we had this amazing preview before the show where Donatella was talking about Vunk, and it was all quite brilliant. But I think really the moment I chose in the end is reflective of things that I often choose, which are fashion moments that have something to do with a good jumper. So I've picked Johnny Rotten wearing the striped mohair jumper from 1976. It's that amazing picture of him with a can of Carlsberg, and he looks quite spotty, and it's kind of like green and white and red, sort of thick band stripes. And I think probably the reason I picked that is because about, I suppose 25 years later, I ended up buying a jumper very similar to that from Marc by Marc Jacobs. And it's not in the context in which that jumper then appeared in Marc by Marc show in autumn-winter 2011. It didn't look very punk. And that's kind of what I think sort of interesting about it, is that punk has a kind of massive influence way beyond just being about nose studs and things that hang off your clothes, you know, like safety pins or whatever. And this outfit from Marc by Marc is actually, you know, it's kind of more sort of 70s in a kind of the jumpers with a pair of wide herringbone slacks and some plimsolls. So that for me felt like a bit of a punk personal moment, because I've got that jumper, I've worn that jumper, and I've had the furball after wearing a mohair jumper all day that inevitably happens, that by the end of the day you're just coughing up great big lumps of mohair. So that was kind of, I think for me, my why I chose that moment.
It's really interesting because you mentioned that Marc kind of, it didn't feel particularly punkish when it was done sort of on a modern Marc Jacobs runway, and then you also cited Donatella Versace's, you know, Vunk collection, which got quite a lot of stick because it showed you how much punk can kind of lose its message when it's done in a high fashion context. And I'm quite interested in the contrast, because you kind of toyed with it then between something that is so punk, like Johnny Rotten in that original jumper, but then how it can, do you think that punk's message does always get kind of a bit lost when it's translated onto a high fashion runway?
I think probably it does a bit, yeah. I mean, I remember reading, when I was at college, I remember reading that Vivienne Westwood biography, and, you know, I think in that it sort of talks a lot about how punk was this really small moment. It didn't last for very long. I think, I scribbled down some notes somewhere, I think they say somewhere in the book it lasted for like 30 months. It wasn't a very long thing, and also that it was a very intense burst. And I just sort of think that those bursts of energy tend to kind of be quite a small group of people that are participating in that, and then inevitably it sort of spills out elsewhere and gets sort of suckered up into popular culture more generally. I mean, I was also, when I was getting into this jumper tip, because I just sort of thought, well, I'm sure this jumper has been referenced before because it's such a kind of iconic piece of knitwear. I sort of did a bit more trawling, and Junya Watanabe did a very punky thing in his women's collection for 2006. And he did another sort of variation on that jumper with a kind of a sort of headdress that reminds me of Michelle Pfeiffer in playing Catwoman in Batman Returns. And the model's wearing sort of like a sort of tartan trousers and a barbed wire kind of sort of belt. And it's kind of, it's almost exactly the same kind of jumper. Again, that sort of mohair, thick stripes, lots of different colours. And I think those things, those kinds of pieces do just resonate with designers when they're working and they're researching and they're looking at an areas and then changing that context. Because the third catwalk jumper punk reference that I've stumbled upon is actually from Autumn Winter 2013. So when I was looking at a lot of Johnny's other jumpers, the other favourite of mine is there's a sort of monochrome one which he wore on the Bill Grundy or Gruddy show. I don't know how to pronounce his name. I think again from the mid-70s. And actually Marnie have got a jumper in their autumn winter collection, which is again almost an exact riff on that. I mean, I think what they've done is switch the black and white around. So instead of it having black shoulders and a white front, it's got white shoulders and a black front, and they've given it a kind of Marnie twist by putting a red singular cuff on it. So, you know, I sort of think it's interesting. And again, that outfit style for Marnie doesn't look in any way punk in a kind of barbed wire sort of way. It's quite polite and nerdy and cute. So yeah, I think those things always get kind of sort of change. The context of those things definitely changes.
And I guess, do you think there's almost nothing wrong with that? You know, if you look at staples like denim jeans, black leather jackets, they've come from a context which is very alien to how they're now worn. Do you think there's nothing really wrong with that? That's just how fashion develops. Because some people are very precious about punk. You know, they say punk shouldn't be kind of translated and commoditized. You know, people can get a bit angry about that.
Well, I mean, personally, I think that punk moment, that very short burst of punk moment, can never really be turned into commodity, because it's a moment in history that the people that were involved in it were obviously incredibly innovative, and they shook things up and they made a statement and they did something very meaningful to them. But of course, like any other interesting cultural moment, it's something that people revisit. And in order to revisit that, it means that they have to change it somehow, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily diluting what punk did, because punk, you can't take that away from punk. Punk always did that. And so you can't, and in the same way, I think, you can't say punk owns the mohair jumper. I mean, so we're never going to make mohair jumpers anymore because Johnny Rotten wore them and that was an important part of the punk movement. You know, I just think that's a kind of, you know, you do have to separate the two things a little bit, I think.
So tell me, how far has your jumper obsession gone? Do you buy a new one every season? Are you always on the hunt for like the perfect jumper? Is that kind of your
well, I mean, I definitely do. I do love a bit of knitwear, and I have done, I think, since my grandma made me one when I was little, where she was making a cardi, and she ran out of wool halfway through, so she had to she couldn't buy the wool that she was working with, so she had to buy a contrast wool. So then I ended up with this cardigan, which was 2 different tones of brown. And I just thought this was the best thing ever, because it was like, it wasn't just one colour, it had 2 front panels in a different colour. So my granny's kind of like, you know, stressing out that it should be all one colour, and I'm like, this is amazing.
So you're
a
jumper lover from an early stage?
I think maybe it started from that point, really. But it's definitely something that I always look at, you know, when I'm out at the shows, I'm always looking for a hot jumper. And I also think that, you know, men's jumpers have got a bit more exciting in the last few years. I mean, I think that Mark one from autumn 2011, I feel like I saw quite a lot of people wearing that jumper. I feel like it was around that time that the men's statement jumper, or the it knit, or whatever you want to call it, started to kind of come back. And you know, and then Jonathan Saunders started doing his jumpers, and then, you know, the Marnie one for autumn. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think that the jumper is one of those things I'm always sort of drawn to. I think it's the texture thing, and I think the other thing that's really interesting about the punk jumper is that obviously a lot of the things around the punk look were very spiky and very angry, and there's something incredibly cozy about a mohair jumper. So it's a kind of interesting sort of balance or flip of that spiky, angry punk thing. And I think I also like that about it as well, that it's not, you know, it sort of slightly moves away from all those other very punky things. And I guess punk was a lot to do with texture anyway, you know, the vinyl, the shiny stuff, the spiky stuff. So But there's a coziness about the jumper which I think is kind of ironic given punk's overall message.